The Art of Not Reacting, Why Self-Control is the Ultimate Power, by the Audiobook Space. Someone said something to you recently. Maybe it was a comment, maybe it was a criticism, maybe it was something so small and so petty that you were almost embarrassed by how much it affected you, and you reacted. Maybe you snapped back. Maybe you went quiet in a way that said everything. Maybe you spent the next 3 hours replaying the conversation in your head, thinking of everything you should have said, everything you wish you had done differently. And here is the thing that nobody tells you about that moment. The moment you reacted, they won. Not because they were right, not because their comment had merit, not because they deserved to win, but because they pulled you off your center. They disturbed your peace. They made you spend your energy, your most valuable, most finite resource, responding to them instead of building toward what matters to you. Every single time you react emotionally to a provocation, to an insult, to a slight, to a frustrating situation, to someone who is deliberately trying to get a rise out of you, you hand them your power, completely, freely, without them having to take it from you. And the most dangerous people you will ever encounter, the most strategic, the most psychologically sophisticated, know this. They provoke deliberately. They watch your reactions carefully, and they use what they learn to control you. Today, we're going to take that power back. We're going to talk about the art of not reacting, the deepest, most ancient, most powerful form of self-mastery that human beings have ever discovered. And by the end of this audiobook experience, you will never give your power away the same way again. Let's begin. 2,000 years ago, in the most powerful empire on Earth, a man sat alone in a military tent on the border of a barbarian territory and wrote in his private journal. He was not writing for publication. He was not writing for posterity. He was writing for himself. A daily practice of self-examination, self-correction, and philosophical reflection that he maintained with extraordinary consistency despite being one of the most powerful and besieged figures in the ancient world. The man was Marcus Aurelius, Roman emperor, commander of armies, administrator of an empire spanning 3 continents. And the journal he kept, never intended for anyone else's eyes, became one of the most read books in human history. We call it Meditations. And at its core, beneath the philosophy, beneath the Stoic frameworks, beneath the historical context, it is a 20-year record of one man's relentless, disciplined, imperfect effort to master a single skill: the art of not reacting. The ability to face the full catastrophe of human experience, betrayal, loss, injustice, provocation, pressure, failure, and respond from a place of reason, principle, and deliberate choice rather than from the volatile, impulsive, easily manipulated place of unexamined emotion. Marcus Aurelius was not born with this skill. He worked at it every single day. He failed at it regularly and wrote about those failures with extraordinary honesty. And he kept working at it. Because he understood something that the greatest minds in every era of human history have understood. Self-control is not a personality trait. It is the ultimate power. The person who cannot control themselves can be controlled by anyone. The person who masters themselves cannot be controlled by anyone. Today, we are going to break down the art of not reacting into 10 clear, practical, deeply researched principles: the philosophy, the psychology, the neuroscience, and the real-world application of the most powerful skill a human being can develop. Principle number 1. Understand what reaction actually costs you. Before we can talk about how to stop reacting, we need to understand with complete clarity what reacting actually costs. Because most people dramatically underestimate the price. They think of a reactive episode as an isolated event. Someone provokes them, they react, the moment passes, life continues. The cost seems contained, a brief loss of composure, perhaps an awkward aftermath, maybe a mild sense of embarrassment. But the cost is never contained, and it is never brief. Consider what actually happens when you react emotionally to a provocation. First, you reveal yourself. Every emotional reaction is intelligence handed to whoever provoked it. When you lose your temper, you reveal that your ego is vulnerable to criticism. When you panic, you reveal that your confidence is fragile. When you become defensive, you reveal exactly which accusations have the most truth in them, because we rarely defend ourselves passionately against accusations that carry no weight. Every reaction is a map of your interior, and anyone sophisticated enough to read that map now knows exactly how to navigate you. Second, you lose credibility. In almost every professional and social environment, emotional reactivity signals a lack of trustworthiness and judgment. The person who can be rattled is the person who cannot be trusted with high-stakes situations. One public reactive episode can undo years of carefully built reputation. We remember the moments people lost control with disproportionate vividness, because emotional volatility is alarming in a way that calm consistency never is. Third, you make worse decisions. The neuroscience is clear and consistent on this point. When the amygdala is activated, when you are in a state of emotional reactivity, the prefrontal cortex, which governs rational judgment, impulse control, and considered decision-making, is functionally impaired. You literally cannot think as clearly when you are reacting as when you are calm. Every decision made in a reactive state is a worse decision than the same decision made from composure. Fourth, you give away your energy. Every reactive episode costs emotional energy, the finite daily resource that determines how much you can think, create, build, and contribute. Every minute spent in reactive emotion is a minute not spent building something. Every hour of rumination following a reactive episode is an hour of productivity surrendered to someone who may not have deserved a single second of your attention. Ryan Holiday, whose book The Obstacle is the Way introduced Stoic philosophy to a new generation, writes about this in terms of what he calls the event-impression-response framework. Between every event and your response is an impression, a judgment, an interpretation. Most people treat that impression as automatic and inevitable. The Stoics understood that the impression can be examined, challenged, and changing the impression changes the response. The first step to mastering the art of not reacting is developing a visceral, bone-deep understanding of what your reactions are actually costing you. Because when the price becomes clear, when you can see in real time what you are giving away, the motivation to stop paying it becomes very different. Principle number 2. Master the physiology first. The art of not reacting is not primarily a philosophical challenge. Before it is a mindset problem, before it is a habit problem, before it is a character problem, it is a physiological problem. And solving it requires understanding what is happening in your body when a provocation arrives. When a perceived threat, and to the brain, a social provocation is a genuine threat, hits your nervous system, a cascade of physiological events unfolds in milliseconds. The amygdala fires. Cortisol and adrenaline flood the bloodstream. Heart rate accelerates. Blood pressure rises. Muscles tense. Breathing becomes shallow and rapid. The body mobilizes for fight or flight. This response evolved over millions of years to protect you from physical danger. It is extraordinarily effective at that function. But it is profoundly unhelpful when the threat is a colleague's dismissive comment rather than a predator. The problem is that the body does not make this distinction. The amygdala does not ask whether the threat is physical or social, real or imagined, proportionate or trivial. It responds. And in responding, it hijacks the very faculties, calm judgment, clear thinking, considered response, that you need to handle the situation well. The physiological solution is breath. Not as a metaphor, not as self-help advice, as a hardwired neurological mechanism. The first step to mastering the art of not reacting is developing a visceral, bone-deep understanding of what your reactions are actually. The breath is the only autonomic function, the only bodily process that operates automatically without conscious control, that can also be consciously controlled. And through that control, it directly influences the autonomic nervous system, shifting the body from sympathetic activation, the fight or flight state, to parasympathetic activation, the rest and recover state. Specifically, a slow, extended exhale, longer than the inhale, directly activates the vagus nerve, which is the primary pathway of the parasympathetic nervous system. Heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, the stress hormone cascade slows, the prefrontal cortex re-engages. This is not a slow process. A single extended exhale, 4 counts in, 6 to 8 counts out, produces measurable physiological calming within seconds. Navy SEALs use a specific version of this technique called box breathing, 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out, 4 counts hold, as a real-time tool for maintaining composure under conditions of extreme stress and danger. If it works for special operations soldiers under fire, it will work for you in a difficult meeting. The physiological mastery of reaction is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Because no amount of philosophical understanding, no depth of stoic wisdom, no strength of character will help you if your body is in a state of full sympathetic activation and your prefrontal cortex is offline. Breathe first, always, without exception. Principle number 3. Create distance between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl's principle that between stimulus and response there is a space, and in that space lies our freedom, is the philosophical foundation of everything in this audiobook. But how do you actually create that space in the moment, when every instinct, every physiological impulse, and every conditioned pattern is driving you toward immediate reaction? There are several proven techniques. Each creates distance in a different way. The first is temporal distance, simply delaying your response. This sounds trivially simple and is extraordinarily powerful. The rule: never respond to an emotionally charged message, email, or situation in the same moment it arrives. If someone sends you a provocative email, close it. Come back in an hour. Come back tomorrow. The response you write in an hour will be dramatically better than the response you would have written in the first 60 seconds of reactive emotion. Abraham Lincoln had a famous practice of writing what he called hot letters, letters expressing his full, uncensored anger at someone who had wronged him, and then never sending them. He would write the letter, feel the catharsis of full expression, fold it, mark it never sent, never signed, and file it away. He understood that the need to express anger and the wisdom of expressing it are two completely different things. The second technique is physical distance. Remove yourself from the triggering environment. Step outside, walk to another room, take a bathroom break. The physical act of leaving a triggering environment reduces the intensity of the emotional activation and creates the mental space that proximity to the trigger prevents. Breathe first, always, without exception.
The third is perspective distance. The technique of asking, will this matter in 10 years? Will this matter in 10 months? Will this matter in 10 minutes? This temporal perspective shift, pulling back from the immediate urgency of the provocation to the long arc of your life, almost always reveals the triviality of what seemed urgent and important a moment ago. The fourth is identity distance, the practice of observing the reaction rather than being the reaction. Instead of, I am angry, try, I notice anger arising. Instead of, I am threatened, try, I notice a threat response. This subtle linguistic shift from first-person identity fusion to third-person observation creates the cognitive distance that prevents the emotion from consuming your entire field of awareness. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly. He would describe his own emotional responses in the third person in his journal, as if observing an interesting natural phenomenon rather than being controlled by one. The emperor notices irritation. The emperor observes the impulse to respond harshly. The emperor chooses otherwise. Distance is not suppression. You are not pretending the emotion does not exist. You are creating enough space between the emotion and your response to allow a better choice to emerge. Principle 4. Know your triggers. The most dangerous triggers are the ones you do not know you have. Because unknown triggers operate in the dark, they fire without warning. They produce reactions that seem, to you and to everyone watching, to be disproportionate to the situation, because the situation in front of you is not actually what you are reacting to. You are reacting to everything the situation reminds you of, to the accumulated weight of every previous experience that shares its emotional signature. The colleague whose tone reminds you of a critical parent, the boss whose dismissiveness echoes a teacher who humiliated you in class at 12 years old, the partner whose silence activates the abandonment fear that was installed by a relationship that ended badly years ago. These are not responses to the present, they are echoes of the past. And they are extraordinarily difficult to manage because they happen so fast and feel so justified that by the time you recognize what is happening, you have already reacted. The first step to managing triggers is mapping them. This is inner work. It requires honesty and a willingness to look at yourself without flinching. Ask yourself, what situations, what types of people, what specific behaviors consistently provoke my strongest reactions? What is the common thread? What do my reaction patterns reveal about my deepest insecurities, my unresolved wounds, my most sensitive points of ego? This mapping process is uncomfortable. The ego resists it fiercely because seeing your triggers clearly means seeing yourself clearly, and what we see is not always flattering. But the person who has mapped their triggers has an extraordinary advantage over the person who has not. They are not surprised. When a familiar trigger activates, they recognize it in real time. This is my abandonment trigger. This is my authority trigger. This is my competence trigger. And recognition, the simple act of naming what is happening, creates enough distance to choose the response rather than simply executing the reaction. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who was born a slave, taught under threat of violence and developed a philosophy of inner freedom under conditions of complete outer constraint, said that it is not events that disturb us, but our judgments about events. Your triggers are your judgments, the interpretations, the stories, the meanings you have attached to certain types of events based on your history. Change the judgment, and you change the emotional response. But you cannot change your judgment you cannot see. Map your triggers, know yourself, and watch how much power the world loses over your internal state.
Principle 5. The power of strategic silence. There is a response to provocation that is more powerful than any clever comeback, any devastating argument, any perfectly timed rebuttal. Silence. Strategic, deliberate, unshakable silence. And almost nobody uses it, because silence feels passive. It feels like conceding. It feels like letting the other person win. But here is what silence actually communicates at a deep psychological level to anyone who has provoked you and received it in return. It says, what you just said was not significant enough to require my energy. It says, I am so secure in myself that your attempt to disturb me has produced nothing. It says, I am operating from a place you cannot reach. And here is what happens in the mind of the person who provoked you and received silence. They are disoriented. They expected a reaction, anger, defensiveness, hurt, justification. Any of these would have confirmed their power over you. Any of these would have given them something to work with. Silence gives them nothing. and in the absence of the expected reaction, their own insecurity fills the void. They begin to wonder, did that land? Do they not care? Are they planning something? Am I being ridiculous? The power dynamic in that silence quietly but completely shifts. Robert Greene, author of The 48 Laws of Power, one of the most studied books on power dynamics ever written, makes this point in Law 4, always say less than necessary. He writes that powerful people impress and intimidate by saying less. The more you say, the more likely you are to say something foolish. Silence makes people uncomfortable. Silence is power.
Principle number 6. Respond to the reality, not the story. One of the most important insights in all of cognitive psychology is this. We do not react to what happens. We react to the story we tell about what happens. And our stories, shaped by our history, our insecurities, our assumptions, our ego, are frequently wrong. The colleague who did not respond to your email is ignoring you. Or they are overwhelmed, or the email went to spam, or they are dealing with something personal you know nothing about. The friend who canceled plans is pulling away from the relationship, or they had an emergency, or they are struggling and unable to show up, or it is simply a scheduling conflict with no deeper meaning. The boss who seemed cold in the meeting does not respect you, or they were distracted by something entirely unrelated to you, or they had received difficult news that morning, or their coldness is simply their baseline communication style and has nothing to do with you. In each of these cases, you can generate a reaction based entirely on a story, an interpretation that may have no relationship to reality, that produces real emotional pain, real behavioral consequences, and real damage to relationships and opportunities. Byron Katie, the author and teacher known for her inquiry process called The Work, built an entire methodology around 4 questions designed to examine the stories we tell about events. Is it true? Can I absolutely know it is true? How do I react when I believe this thought? Who would I be without this thought? These questions create the cognitive space to examine the story rather than simply inhabiting it. And in that examination, the story almost always reveals itself to be far less certain than it felt. Emotionally disciplined people have developed the habit of asking before they react, am I responding to what actually happened or to the story I am telling about what happened? That question, asked consistently, eliminates an enormous percentage of unnecessary reactive episodes. Because most of the provocations we react to are not events, they are interpretations of events, and interpretations can be changed. Before you react, ask, is this the reality, or is this my story about the reality? Principle number 7. Use provocation as information. Here is a complete reframe of how to think about the people and situations that provoke you. They are not obstacles. They are teachers. Every person who consistently triggers a strong reaction in you is showing you something about yourself that deserves your attention. Every situation that reliably produces an emotional reaction is pointing to an area of your psychology that has not yet been fully integrated. This is not comfortable. The ego strongly prefers to locate the problem externally, in the provocateur, in the unfairness of the situation, in the behavior of others. It is much more comfortable to be right about how wrong they are than to turn the lens inward and ask what the reaction reveals about you. But the inward turn is where the growth lives. The Stoics called this practice turning the obstacle upside down. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way. Every provocation, every difficulty, every person who tests your composure is an opportunity to practice the very skill whose development will make you most powerful. Jocko Willink, the former Navy SEAL commander and author of Extreme Ownership, has a phrase that has become something of a philosophy in itself. Good. When something goes wrong, when a plan fails, when a situation deteriorates, when a provocation lands harder than expected, his response is simply good, because now I can adapt.
Now I can learn. Now I can practice. That reframe from provocation as threat to provocation as training does not make the provocation easier to receive, but it changes your relationship to it fundamentally. Instead of an unwanted intrusion into your peace, it becomes an invitation to build the very resilience, composure, and self-mastery that you are cultivating. The most provocative people in your life are your most efficient teachers. Not because they are right, not because their behavior is acceptable, but because the reaction they produce in you is showing you exactly where you still have work to do. Principle number 8. Build the identity of a non-reactor. Everything we have discussed so far, the physiology, the distance, the trigger mapping, the strategic silence, are techniques, tools, practices. But techniques without identity are fragile. They work when you remember to use them, when you are not caught off guard, when the provocation is not too severe. The deepest level of the art of not reacting is identity level. Not I am trying to react less, but I am someone who does not react. James Clear in Atomic Habits makes the distinction between outcome-based change and identity-based change. Outcome-based change says I want to stop losing my temper. Identity-based change says I am someone with extraordinary composure. Every action I take is a vote for that identity. The difference is not semantic, it is structural. Because when your non-reactivity is an outcome you are trying to achieve, every failure is a setback. But when your non-reactivity is an identity you are building, every moment of composure, however small, is a confirmation of who you are. And every failure is simply a temporary inconsistency with an identity that is still being solidified.
How do you build this identity? Through deliberate, consistent, accumulated votes. The moment you pause before responding when you would have previously snapped, vote for the identity. The moment you choose silence when you would have previously defended, vote for the identity. The moment you breathe before reacting when your body wanted to explode, vote for the identity. None of these individual votes are dramatic. Each one is barely noticeable, but compounded over weeks, months, and years, the identity solidifies. The non-reactive self becomes not an aspiration, but simply who you are. And when that identity is established, when composure is your baseline rather than your goal, something extraordinary happens. The things that used to provoke you stop provoking you. Not because they changed, because you did.
Principle number 9. The long game of self-mastery. Here's the truth about the art of not reacting that nobody who teaches it wants to say. It is never finished. Marcus Aurelius, who spent 20 years writing meditations, who had access to the best Stoic teachers of his era, who was one of the most philosophically committed practitioners of self-mastery in recorded history, still lost his temper, still reacted when he should not have, still wrote about his failures with painful honesty and recommitted to the practice the following day. The goal is not perfection. The goal is progress. The gradual, inconsistent, non-linear, deeply worth it progress toward a version of yourself that is less ruled by the volatile weather of circumstance and more anchored in the bedrock of character. Ryan Holiday, whose series of books on Stoic philosophy have introduced these ideas to millions of modern readers, describes self-mastery not as a destination, but as a practice, like fitness. You do not arrive at fitness and then stop needing to exercise. You maintain it through ongoing practice. The moment you stop, the gains begin to erode. Self-mastery is the same. The person who has worked on their reactivity for 5 years is not done. They are simply operating from a higher baseline than they were 5 years ago. And their failures, when they come, and they will come, land differently now. Not as evidence of permanent inadequacy, but as information about where the next level of work lives. This long-game understanding changes your relationship to setbacks in the practice. When you react, and you will react, it is not a reason to abandon the practice. It is data. It is showing you which trigger is still raw, which situation still bypasses your composure, which wound is still asking for your attention. The Stoics called this ascesis, the practice of ongoing, lifelong self-examination and self-correction, not in the spirit of harsh self-judgment, but in the spirit of the craftsman who examines their work honestly, sees where it falls short of their standard, and returns to the bench the following morning. You are not trying to become someone who never feels provoked. You are building someone who, when provoked, chooses. That is the art. And the art, like all arts, is never finished. It only deepens.
Principle number 10. Self-mastery is the root of all other power. We arrive at the deepest and most important principle of this entire audiobook experience, the one that ties every other principle together, the one that places the art of not reacting in its proper context, not as a social skill, not as a conflict management technique, not as a professional competence, but as the foundation of every other form of human power and achievement. Self-mastery is the root of all other power. Think about it. Financial discipline, the ability to delay gratification, to resist the impulse to spend, to invest consistently over decades despite short-term discomfort, requires self-mastery. Physical health, the ability to maintain a diet, to exercise consistently, to sleep well, to resist the constant pull of easy comfort, requires self-mastery. Professional excellence, the ability to focus deeply on difficult work, to persist through setbacks and failures, to maintain standards under pressure, requires self-mastery. Relationships, the ability to listen rather than defend, to give rather than take, to stay present through difficulty rather than escape into distraction, requires self-mastery. Leadership, the ability to make clear decisions under pressure, to remain calm when those around you are panicking, to hold a steady course when external circumstances are chaotic, requires self-mastery. Every domain of human excellence, examined closely enough, reveals self-mastery at its foundation. This is why the ancient Greek aphorism, carved into the stone of the Temple of Apollo at Delphi, was not know your market, or know your enemy, or know your opportunity. It was know yourself. Because the person who knows themselves, who has mapped their triggers, examined their reactions, understood their patterns, and built the discipline to choose their responses, has access to a form of power that no external circumstance can touch. The Stoics called this the inner citadel, the fortress of the self that no external force can breach without your permission, the place of absolute sovereignty that exists inside every human being but is only inhabited by those who have done the work. Viktor Frankl found his inner citadel in a Nazi concentration camp. In conditions of complete physical powerlessness, where every external freedom had been taken, he discovered that the one freedom that could never be taken was the freedom to choose his response to his circumstances. And from that one inviolable freedom, he built a philosophy, a life, and a legacy that has outlasted his captors by generations. You will never face what Frankl faced, but the principle is available to you in every dimension of your life. The person who masters themselves cannot be manipulated, cannot be destabilized, cannot be controlled, cannot be diminished by circumstance or provocation or the opinions of others. Not because they feel nothing, but because they choose everything. That is the ultimate power. That is the art of not reacting, and it is entirely, completely, unconditionally yours to build. Understanding the real cost of reaction, what you reveal, what you lose, what you give away every time you are pulled off your center. Mastering the physiology first, because before it is a mindset problem, it is a body problem, and the breath is the key. Creating distance between stimulus and response, temporal, physical, perspective, identity. Knowing your triggers, mapping the interior landscape that determines your reactions before they happen. The power of strategic silence, the response that hands nothing back and communicates everything. Responding to reality rather than the story, asking whether you are reacting to what happened or to what you decided it meant. Using provocation as information, turning every trigger into a teacher and every obstacle into a training ground. Building the identity of a non-reactor,
not trying to react less, but becoming someone who does not react. The long game of self-mastery, accepting that this practice is never finished, only deepened. And the deepest truth of all, that self-mastery is the root of every other form of power, achievement, and freedom available to a human being. Marcus Aurelius wrote, in his private journal for no audience but himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That sentence is 2,000 years old. It is more true today than the day it was written, because the world has not become less chaotic or less provocative or less designed to pull you off your center. If anything, it has become more so. More noise, more provocation, more manufactured outrage, more systems designed to capture your attention and monetize your reaction. In that world, the person who cannot be provoked into reaction is not just powerful, they are free.